Hi, all. My name is Emily Province, and this is a video about one of the risk factors that tends to contribute to election violence. I've said before that people who are full-time experts in this field, people who work day to day, day in and day out, week after week, year after year, in preventing election violence, still actually can't predict completely accurately whether and where and how election violence might happen. But what they have done is they've taken a look at a bunch of countries where election violence has happened in the past. And then they've looked at what things were like in that country immediately before that happened. So the question that they're looking at is, can we get a sense of what conditions make it more likely that election violence might happen in a particular place? There's a whole bunch of risk factors. The United Nations lists dozens, but I'm actually going to look at just three that tend to be the most common. And today we're going to focus on one. The first risk factor for election violence is whether the country has a recent history of election violence. In other words, is it already happening in this place? The reason why this tends to cause additional election violence, there's really two reasons. One is that recent violence tends to make people feel like violence is more normal. So here's how that works. I look around, I see that there have been incidents of violence happening in my country around election cycles. And I think to myself, well, maybe that's kind of acceptable to me. Maybe that's just part of how the process works. There's also this little trick that our brains tend to play on us. And it's something that our brains have to be able to do because we're not capable of living in a state of extreme anxiety for a really long time. That starts to have a bad physiological effect on us. So what our brains do is if we're feeling very, very alarmed, our brain starts to trick us into a new concept of what's normal. Because if I think violence is normal, then I'm less alarmed about it. And again, that makes me think that violence is more socially acceptable. The other reason why recent examples of election violence make future election violence more likely is because of what's known as the myth of redemptive violence. This is that idea that if you're violent toward me, I have to be violent toward you. And actually, that's going to fix the problem because I'm good and you're evil. But the reality is, redemptive violence doesn't work. Meeting violence with violence tends, in most cases, to scale up the violence and cause additional layers of it. But a lot of people believe that you meet violence with violence, and that's why it's because of that belief that recent violence makes future violence more likely. The United States does have a recent history of election violence. We've had some experiences in 2020, 2022, and 2024. They have been relatively few and relatively minor in comparison to what has happened in many other countries. I say that because that's just a matter of integrity. Let's be honest about what's going on. But also, it has been happening in the United States. As a quick reminder, election violence is physical violence, severe psychological violence, or destruction of property of monetary or symbolic value that's either motivated by an election cycle or intended to influence an election cycle. I'm recording this on June 3rd of 2024, and at this point, the best example of election violence we have in connection with 2024 is ongoing threats against election officials. People whose full-time job it is to administrate elections are receiving really very serious threats against their personal welfare and the welfare of their families. That is an example of election violence. We counter this particular social pattern. So if we're pushing back, we want to say, okay, there's a recent history of election violence in our country. But you know what? Election violence is not normal, and it's also not necessary. That's the narrative. That's the story that we want to tell. Election violence is not normal, and it is not necessary. Not normal, meaning we expect people in our community to be peaceful. We can actually engage in peace campaigns and just talk to folks about, whatever your political opinions are and however you feel about the way the election is going. Violence is not a way to solve that problem. And then the other piece we talk about is it's not necessary. There are so many other options available to us, different civic options like I don't like the way that the election is going. I'm going to talk to my representatives. I'm going to start a campaign. I'm going to have a nonviolent protest. I'm going to write a letter to the editor. I'm going to start petitions. I'm going to put pressure on candidates using political pressure to make changes. These are the kinds of nonviolent actions that are available to people. And civic education means making sure that everybody knows about this. The nonviolent option is better. It's actually more effective. Okay, just to do a quick recap, there are 3 major risk factors in the environment for election violence. Today, we talked about one of them, which is a recent history of election violence. And the way that we counter a recent history of election violence is by creating a narrative, a story, something that is understood in our community about the fact that violence is not necessary and it is not normal in connection with an election. Next time we talk, I'll cover a second risk factor,